think most of us will assume I'm asking that rhetorically. Of course, theology matters. But again, given some of the things we're talking about, between COVID and social justice and political division and the state of the environment, I think it's a real question for people when they come to church. What are they expecting to hear? Do they expect a timely word, something to help them? Or to what degree is part of our task and calling to surprise them with the way in which the tradition of the church theology matters? And I'm particularly interested, does Luther's theology still matter? And to sort of move toward that, I want to start with the Emmaus story, which is another of my favorites. You know it well, for time's sake, I won't read the whole thing, but the two disciples are walking. A stranger comes among them, or Jesus comes, they don't recognize it. What are you talking about? They're kind of amazed that he hasn't heard. And then this last line just, I think four of the saddest words in Scripture. And also for the most poignant and realistic. But we had hoped. And the number of times people could say that about, we had hoped recovery would hold this time. We had hoped remission would last longer. We had hoped for a better society for our kids and grandkids to live into. It just captures so much of that. And then kind of to jump to the end of the story, after Jesus is persuaded to stay and breaks bread and is revealed in the breaking of the bread, and then about to get up and go back to Jerusalem to share this word. Excuse me. And they say, "Were not our hearts burning within us?" While he was opening up the scriptures, which is another kind of hopefulness or renewal. And so when I think about Emmaus, I think about it as a story of hope, both its erosion and its restoration. And when I think about a lot of the things going on in this world, one way to analyze the impact, each of these problems has its own context, but collectively part of the impact, and I think one of the really dangerous elements of that is there's been a profound erosion of hope. And I worry about what happens to community when hope is absent. Now, I often just sort of feel compelled, you know this, but to distinguish, I feel like a lot of folks, when you talk about hope, they think optimism. And I think there's a really crucial difference that the Christian tradition can offer around optimism, the thought that things are going to get better. Hope, the confidence that there will be a good end, regardless of whether things get better in the near future or not. And so from the Apostle Paul, not only that, but we boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint, because God's love has been poured into the church, the Holy Spirit has been given to us. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Stockdale paradox. Admiral James Stockdale was POW for 7 years and tortured more than 30 times. And when he was being interviewed by Jim Collins, the Good to Great author, at one point, Collins said, could you sort of name, or have you had a chance to think about the difference between those who made it out of the camps and those who didn't? And Stockdale said, excuse me, almost immediately, absolutely, the optimists were the ones who didn't make it. And Collins said, what do you mean? He said, well, the optimists were the ones who would say, well, we'll be out by Christmas. And then Christmas came and we'll be out by Easter. Easter came and went. A year later, we'll be out by Christmas. And then he said this, which has been come to be called the Stockdale paradox. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can't afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of the current reality, whatever they may be. That is a sense of what hope is. So back to the story again briefly. But we had hoped, and then the story goes on, and then I like this last line again. It kind of resonates with what we were talking about with Bonhoeffer, the difference between application and interpretation. Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted them, the things about himself in Scripture. And then jumping to the end again, it's not just where our hearts were burning, but while he was opening the Scriptures to us. And so thinking about preaching as a means by which to communicate and create, rather, communities of hope. And that theology as what shapes both the content and the form of our preaching. Theology as reflection on and counsel regarding the church's proclamation. And so here's kind of what I want to get to a little bit. Sorry, I'm just going to grab some water while I'm talking. You know, my assertion from my life and, thank you, experience and training is, you know, why Lutheran Institute matters. But again, I think it's important to kind of treat this as a question, particularly in our communities. And when I think about this question, I'm not thinking about it first, actually, of all of us. I'm thinking about it of these are my kids. Jack and Katie at Jack's graduation from boot camp in the Navy. And to give you a sense of my affection for all things Lutheran, Jack's name is John Frederick. One of Luther's electors, John Frederick the Steadfast, and Arcadia is Catherine. So I do have kind of an affection and affinity, thank you, for all things Luther, but don't want to take that for granted. So here's what I want to do. I want to talk about theology and offer some elements of Luther's theology, like name them and open them up a little bit, but then try to hit the question of why it matters, or where its existential value, where the rubber hits the road. So we'll kind of keep moving back and forth across a couple elements of Luther's theology, beginning with a description, and then a translation or interpretation. And one of the things that I want to kind of work at, or I find really helpful teaching in a parish, is to employ what Karl Barth sometimes would call secular parables. And that is recognizing the distinctive, salvific, redemptive content of Christian theology, but recognizing that there are all kinds of things around us, particularly in the world of the arts, that can point to or hint at or tell part of the truth and help us in sharing the truth. And so that's why I would call them kind of parables. They need to be opened up and explored. And secular, you can learn a lot. They're not quite the same, but it helps you sometimes understand what we're trying to get at. So I'm going to work at that a little bit. But getting to that, I just kind of want to have two caveats or warnings. I'm not going to apologize. I've been paying attention. You know, it did occur to me, I think why we apologize at the outset is we are generously sharing our own insecurities with our community. We're feeling inadequate and we're asking for absolution ahead of time. And that happens sometimes in sermons when I would tell preachers in preaching classes, you know, if you're feeling inadequate about your sermon because you're tired, you didn't do enough work or whatever, that's your issue. Own it. Do not ask the congregation to make you feel better. So I will not apologize. But I will offer these two little warnings. One, I think we love this interpretation, but it involves some translation, and that's always risky. It invites coloring outside the lines. We're not always comfortable doing that. We are, you know why. But sometimes what happens is when you take some risks, people don't respond to it very well. So my kind of question is, are you ready to risk a little heresy? And then just remind you that sometimes, that has some consequences. You're still willing to risk a little heresy. All right, that's caveat number one. Second caveat is choices were made. So there's a lot I want to cover, and I'll try to do it quickly. And if we have till 10, right? Do remind me though, what's the absolute cutoff?
8:45 we'll start vlogging.
Okay. Beautiful. So there's 4 or 5 things I want to try and hit, but at least as many so I don't bring up long gospel. These are some of the things that I find essential and super helpful that I just didn't get into. One of my fantasies is, I used to say I want to write a book. Now I'm like, maybe it'd be more effective to do little short videos, in terms of just getting them out and word on these different elements. So someday later. No long gospel, no civil use, just God's 2 hands, my way of thinking about God's 2 kingdoms, theology of the cross. But here's where we'll go. We'll start with justification by faith, by grace through faith. And remind us all, again, of Luther's problem. God is holy and demands righteousness, and he is not righteous. And so, as Luther writes in the introduction to his New Testament, translation of the New Testament, before those words broke upon my heart, I hated God, and I was angry with him. I was his own creation, but by the standards of the Creator were so far above me that even if I might ever attain them. Eventually, when the Spirit of God, I understood those words, the just shall live by faith. and I felt born again like a new man. I entered through the open doors in the very presence of God. And then I think this is really interesting. Luther then talks about the scriptures that he's been not just a student of, but a teacher of for a number of years. Now I saw the scriptures all together in a different light. They were now my darling and comforting word. They were not there to condemn me, but to save me. And every once in a while, I kind of think about what we're talking about in justification, or what's happening in Luther and the potential for us, is to read that again and substitute the word God for Scripture. Because a lot of what happens is that in Luther's reading of Scripture, he's introduced to a God very different than the one he grew up with or imagined. And so in terms of where the rubber hits the road, the justification orients us to a different God. That in turn invites us to a different relationship with God and offers us a different or new identity that ultimately invites us into a different relationship with each other. Now, here's the question whenever we kind of talk about justification or Luther's issue: do we struggle with Luther's problem? And in every congregation I serve, there actually are a few people who are walking around way down, feeling they could never do enough and God's angry at them. But the percentage of people in that congregation has dramatically shifted from the 16th century to the 21st. And the people outside our congregation, I see very few of them walking around bowed down with the fear that God is just and they're not, and so they're going to be damned to hell. Having said that, if we only imagine it as worry about an angry God, then this doesn't feel that relevant. But at the same time, I would argue that there's never been more pressure to prove yourself or justify yourself. And there are three elements that I think are particularly pressure points right now that I want to touch on. I'll illustrate kind of one. We could do all three, but for the sake of time, I'll just play with one. And the first is what I think of as the issue of consumption and the kind of prevalence of inadequacy marketing. I don't know how much, when you look at commercials, about 95% of them, the goal is to create in the hearer or viewer a sense of lack, a sense that you are missing something essential. So as to create this kind of artificial sense of need, so that the implicit promise is if you buy this or do this or take this action or spend this, then that you will feel more whole or more complete. And there's a whole history to this, kind of cataloged by Jonah Sachs in the book The Story Wars, where around the 20s or 30s, and it begins actually with Listerine, which does a fairly good trade for a while as a sort of medicinal product, something that you would buy when you had a sore throat to gargle, that you would help for. And eventually the growth for Listerine for a decade is fairly steady upward, and then it plateaus. And plateaus make marketers really nervous. And so they come out with a new ad campaign, which ends up eventually being called the Sad Edna campaign. And you can see, if you can see a little more clearly, it's a woman who's just looking kind of forlorn. And the tagline is, often a bridesmaid, never a bride.
For the Listerine.
You're invited to think
Listerine.
Like, why is, young and beautiful and capable Edna? Oh, that's right. And then as you read the small print, what you discover is that Edna has this medical condition that's just devastated her relational life. And it's called halitosis, which is a new phenomenon that's sweeping America. And fortunately, there's a cure for halitosis, and it's Listerine. And lest we worry that Listerine is exclusively gender biased, clearly gender biased, it works so well, Listerine takes off, the sales take off again, that the next year they come out with a similar ad about Sad Marvin. Gender inclusive and make sure that everyone feels inadequate. Everyone buys their product. And then it kind of leads to this, this sort of, going on 80 or 100 years now of tons of voices and tons of money being spent to make us inadequate and to push us to consume in a way that is not true. That is, it's a lie, and it's not sustainable, and in so many ways, and yet so prevalent. Now, along this line of sort of secular parables, I've tried to pull short videos, and most of them are actually commercials, again, just to kind of hint at or get at what we're talking about. And I didn't, we have not been able to link the speaker to the Bluetooth, so we'll see. This next one doesn't have words, so maybe it doesn't matter. Is there a way to, I guess I'll have somebody teach you this. I find that just so kind of interesting and compelling. And this probably came out probably pre onslaught of social media. But I think of the number of kids, girls and boys, who will, take 30 or 40 selfies looking for one that might be acceptable. And the level of pressure to sort of constantly be acceptable, liked, seeking the validation of others and the power of it. So that's kind of one of the three. The other two I won't spend as much time on, but just sort of name. A second one, to think about the politics of division and the active creation of an oppositional identity. That increasingly the push to identify who you are in relation to who you are not, or worse, who you are against, or who they are. And the kind of constant, it's about the strongest misuse of the word virtue I can think of, but the sort of virtue signaling on all different sides or groups to constantly demonstrate that you really are a part of this group and worthwhile, and doing that by vilifying those who disagree with you. And then a third one that I've kind of already alluded to, social media and the constant creation of this need for ongoing affirmation and adulation of this sort of dangerous triangle, because in the culture today, when you walk around and watch the ads or news, they are all incessant. Like, these are three kind of this onslaught coming at us again and again. And in some ways, I think of it as, mirroring the unholy trinity of this obsession with me, myself, and I. And as we talked about before, the kind of cultivation of the culture of the outrageous in the age of the narcissist. Or, to borrow from Luther, the incurvatus se, I think the clearest, cleanest definition of sin I've ever heard. And back to Bonhoeffer for a moment. The pressure to justify ourselves, whether possessions or beauty or wealth or power, has never been greater. And I love this, these two, the way Bonhoeffer phrases it, self-justification and judging others goes together. Because to the degree that you need to prove yourself, then life is one grand competition, and everyone around you is a competitor for that scarce commodity of validation and worth. And then the flip side, just as justification by grace and serving others goes together. And so this kind of pressure to justify yourself is to our detriment, but it's also that of all others. All right, and then the two quotes from Bonhoeffer we looked at once before, and that contrast of what we offer in the absolution and the promise of acceptance and grace at baptism with the rest. All right, that's number one. Number two, to talk a bit about vocation, because I think justification then leads unfailingly into this vocation. And to think about that as the freedom to love and serve our neighbor. Justification is freedom from sin, death, condemnation of the devil, and fear, to add to Luther's kind of four horsemen. But vocation then freedom for extravagant love and service of neighbor. And Luther's ongoing, God does not need your good works. It's kind of like all that time you had put into justifying yourself or making yourself acceptable, you don't have to do that, which means you got a little time in your hands. And you have all these people around you that suddenly are no longer competitors, but brothers and sisters, neighbors, what Luther uses so frequently, to whom we can direct our good works. And I think where the rubber hits the road for this is it points us to the possibility of discovering meaning and purpose all around us, and to recognize the huge craving that I think is probably part and parcel of the human condition, but certainly today, for a sense of meaning, and particularly an emerging generation being assaulted in all kinds of ways that I never was growing up because of the omnipresence of internet and social media, and this craving for a sense of meaning that's bigger than what they're often offered, which is what this second one's about. This one does take words. If we can't hear it, I'll just skip it, but let's see. Yeah? Can you hear a little bit? Okay.
Not so long ago, the high concept ads of today were all but unthinkable.
Soap has never smelled this good before, and neither have you.
Ads laid claim to real, tangible differences between one product and another.
What were brands? They were based on what I call ER words. Whiter, brighter, cleaner, stronger, smoothest, mildest, tastiest. Watch any commercials on American TV and you'll see these words in the first 3 seconds hammered remorselessly into your brain.
But at some point, these words ceased to have meaning. We no longer believed that one product was any brighter or cleaner than any other.
Everything works now, you know. French fries taste crisp, coffee's hot, you know, beer tastes good. Unless you live in America and then you gotta live with what you get.
By the early 1990s, a new approach to marketing came to the fore. One that leapt right over what the product did to what the product meant.
You know, it's not just a color, it's an expression of the culture, an aesthetic that is connected somehow to nature, infinity.
These were the super brands like Nike, Starbucks, the Body Shop, and what they noticed these brands had in common was that they were they were engaging in a kind of sort of pseudo-spiritual marketing. So Nike said that they were about the meaning of sports, but more than that they were about transcendence through sports. Starbucks said that they were about the idea of community, a place that is a third place, that is not home, not work. Benetton were selling multiculturalism, racial diversity.
This lesson that a brand could forge an emotional, even spiritual bond with today's typical consumer wasn't lost on corporate America.
What are you saying with your chocolate plates? This wave of corporate epiphanies in the mid-90s where all these companies, were told, your problem is you don't have that big idea behind your brand. So they would hire high-priced consultants and they would have these kind of corporate sweat lodges and gather around the campfire and sort of try to channel their inner brand meaning. And they would emerge from these processes sort of flushed and say, Polaroid isn't a camera, it's a social lubricant.
When I was a manager at Gamble, my job was basically to make sure the product was good, develop new advertising copy, design the pack. Now, brand manager has an entirely different kind of responsibility. In fact, they have more responsibility. Their job now is to create and maintain a whole meaning system for people through taking identity and understanding of the world. Their job now is to be a community leader. Saturn is a really good example. It's a mass cult brand. For example, 45,000 people turned up to spend a holiday, their vacation time at the factory in Tennessee, instead of going to Disney World or the Grand Canyon. Now, why would they do that? It's because they wanted to meet other people who had Saturns. They wanted to meet the rest of the Saturn family. They wanted to meet the people who made the car. The people who made the car wanted to meet them. And the people who ran the Saturn business knew that. For the summer,
They not only knew it, they turned it into an ad, which only brought more people into the Saturn family.
they called it the Saturn Homecoming. You can see what the idea for a new kind of TV show.
isn't it kind of incredible? I mean, a promise that's made, there's kind of a built-in obsolescence. There is a rush of buying that new thing, and that sort of golden anticipation fulfillment dream is there until you turn it on or use it, and then you're disappointed. But I was struck by that comment of the narrator near the end to offer meaning and community where churches used to do that, where schools, and brands have tried to fill that, and it's disappointing, but we've so bought into the consumption narrative, we just go shopping again. So the possibility then of vocation looking for meaning in the needs of our neighbor. God does not need your good works, right where we find ourselves. I love this quote from Luther, and I heard it first from Tim Winger taught for Confessions for a long time at the Philadelphia Seminary, and his dad mentioned it to him when he was talking about vocation. Well, Tim, you know that where Luther says, when a mother changes her daughter's diapers, God is smiling. Luther, that's great. I'm going to go look it up. And so he looked it up, and then he called his dad and said, Dad, I really appreciate that quote. You got one thing wrong, though. It's when a father changes his daughter's diapers. And we might think that's sort of like accidental, but in the context of the piece Luther's writing, he fills that out a little bit. When a father goes ahead and washes diapers or performs some other common task for his child, even though someone ridicules him as an effeminate fool, God with all his angels and creatures is smiling. So Luther's looking for something intentionally countercultural, a small gesture that when done by faith is not a small gesture, because it's regarded by God as holy and righteous. And so the power of vocation then to sort of help us imagine that the quest for meaning is, a goal for the quest for meaning is all around us. Just the people around us as our neighbor. Two words in the German for neighbor, the person next door or the person in need. And when Luther translates the Good Samaritan parable to German, it is neighbor as the one in need. And when you recognize that, then the possibilities for meaning and purpose and commitment and community are everywhere, as long as you're looking at need. All right, third, the verb efficax, or the efficacious word, the word that most simply translated does what it says. And I think that this passage of Isaiah is so beautiful. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there until they have watered the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, and seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and succeed in the thing for which I sent it. It is the word that does what it says. I have this little dream of someday having Mount Olivet open a brewery that we're going to call the Mount Olivet Volunteer Brewery, or just the Volunteer for short. Doesn't have a good ring. I'll meet you at 4 at the Volunteer. And have it be a not-for-profit, all the proceeds go to community groups, and have constant kind of billboards of where you can get involved in the community, what the needs are. And on a coaster, we're going to have coasters with great Luther beer quotes. will be this one, or at least the first half. I simply taught, preached, and wrote God's word, otherwise I did nothing. And while I slept or drank good Wittenberg beer with my friends Philip and Von Amsdorf, the word did it all. So that's Luther's sense of that. For a while, I was this huge fan of Ben and Jerry's ice cream, the one called Chubby Hubby. And I always called it the Lutheran ice cream. Because it did what it said. And then I found this other, for years that was like my favorite ice cream in the world. And I found this other one at Target called Peanut Butter World. And the first time I had it, I was like transported to this other place. But I didn't notice it was a Target exclusive, like only sold at Target. So I was searching all over, I couldn't find it. And I couldn't remember the name. And I was describing it to someone. I was like, I don't know what to call it. And then I remembered, Chubby Hubby did what it said. So I just decided to call it Fat Bastard. So I actually found it. That's Peanut Butter World. All right, so God's creative word, the word of creation, continues to create, to call things into being out of nothing, including us. The word continues to create out of nothing, calling new things and creating a new reality. One of my favorite works in the English language is Shakespeare's play King Lear. And really, really briefly, Lear is an old man, an old king, and it's time for him to kind of move on. He has 3 daughters. And so his plan is to divide his kingdom into 3 parts and to give one to each of his daughters. And of those 3 daughters, he has a favorite, who is Cordelia. And so he asks each of the daughters to profess in turn how much they love him. And he will then reward them on the basis of the quality of their speech, the profession of love, with these 3 divisions of land. And he has already decided Cordelia will go last, and he will give her the best piece, and he will go live with her. So you can, from the beginning, lots of dysfunction, a pretty warped sense of what makes family. And the first one goes, this is all these flowery things, Goneril, and then Regan, the second daughter, gets up and says, all my sister Goneril said, I say too, and then goes on with more empty words of praise, and then it's Cordelia's turn. And Lear says, Cordelia, how do you speak? And she says, nothing. He says, like, nothing. She's like, nothing. I cannot heat my heart into my mouth. She's the only one who sees like the absolute superficialness of the exercise and so refuses to participate. And so Lear is so angry, he banishes her. And then everything goes wrong. It's the fault of pride and foolishness because the other 2 daughters despise him. So he's kind of cast from one to the other. And at times he's out on the heath and it's storming and he just feels like this is punishment for all his sins. And he has this very strong sense of justice, so he's out there kind of raging for the storm to just batter him because he knows he deserves it. And the worse his punishment is, then he can anticipate the worse the punishment will be for his enemies, which at this point is his 2 daughters. And the line at the end of the storm scene is, for I am a man more sinned against than sinning. So that's kind of Lear's world and his imagination. When you're watching the play or reading it, you're like, this is not that different, than a lot of our common sensibilities about the way the world works or should work. Very obligational, transactional. And then he meets Cordelia at the end of the play, and he has this profound confession that he then says, the kind of apology or confession: if you have poison, I will drink it. For your daughters have no cause to do me wrong, but you do. And then Cordelia, and I've heard that this is the line that the great Shakespearean directors would test the actresses playing Cordelia with. Cordelia's line is no cause. Absolute forgiveness. And right after that, Lear's had these bouts of madness throughout the play. Right after that, then Lear has these words that a lot of interpreters, it's easy to skip over when you're reading and you think it's part of this Lear, and where the other characters in the play think Lear is still a little bit mad. He says, am I in France? And I think those words are like capture that sense of the otherworldly reality of what grace and forgiveness do. Because Lear's England is a place where it's all law. It's all transaction. It's all counting, constantly counting and assessing. And then he's ushered in this world where it's like, you don't count. It's too different, too much, too new. And I think it's easy to forget that that's at the heart of what God really creates, a new reality. And again, you can't prove it, but you recognize it when you see it. So I thought this next clip, it's from television show Big Bang Theory, which the whole time it ran for the 12 years and was super popular, I was like, look down. I didn't know I was watching it. And then just a year or so ago, I kind of stumbled on it and started watching. I was like, I'm embarrassed that I skipped it for 12 years, and I'm embarrassed how much I love it. I watched it twice all the way through. It's 12 seasons. Anyway, so this is a scene, if you don't know the characters, the couple characters that you see, they're bunch of geeky physicists, and this beautiful young woman who lives across the hallway, and kind of their interactions and relationships. The main characters here are Sheldon, who's like the most brilliant and most socially awkward of the 4, and Penny, and they've the next door neighbor, and they've had this discussion about Christmas, and Sheldon, can't stand Christmas, it's just this pagan festival of Saturnalia. and he hates gift giving. It's an obligation. All it is I give you something that you have to give me something, and very transactional. And Penny insists that she is going to give the two roommates, Sheldon and Leonard, a Christmas gift. And this creates a crisis for Sheldon. What am I going to do? How am I going to get out of this? I don't want to be embarrassed socially. And so this is the scene near the end where Sheldon's come to some resolution.
Great news, Leonard. I've solved my penny gift dilemma. Give me. You said the danger was that I might under or over reciprocate, but I've devised a foolproof plan. I will open her gift to me first, and then excuse myself, feigning digestive distress. Then I'll look up the price of her gift online, choose the basket closest to that value, give it to her, and then I'll return the others for a full refund. Brilliant. It is, isn't it? Is it okay if I hide them in your room? The smell makes me nauseated. Do whatever you want. Thank you. That's very gracious. Gentlemen. You just done what Leonard did and get Penny a new boyfriend.
I forgot to mention Sheldon is a big Star Trek fan.
Thanks for asking.
Merry Christmas!
Christmas.
How's your leg?
Very good. Thanks for asking, Tony. Oh, good. And you're here to exchange gifts. You'll be pleased to know I'm prepared for whatever you have to offer.
Okay, here.
I should note, I'm having some digestive distress. So if I excuse myself abruptly, don't be alarmed. Oh, a napkin.
Turn it over.
To Sheldon, live long and prosper. Leonard Nimoy.
He came into the restaurant. Sorry the napkin's dirty. Wipe his mouth with it.
I possess the DNA of Leonard Nimoy.
Yeah, and I guess, but look, he signed it.
Think you realize what this means? All I need is a healthy ovum and I can grow my own Leonard
Okay, all I'm giving you is the napkin, Sheldon.
Be right back.
Here, open it.
Oh, a certificate for motorcycle lessons. Very thoughtful.
Yeah, and I checked. Not letting the bike fall on you while standing still is lesson 1.
Oh, then I think you'll appreciate what I got you.
101 totally cool science experiments for kids.
You know, because you're so into science.
Oh, God.
I know. It's not enough, is it? Here. It's a Saturday miracle.
No, that's good. I love that because it's just in the moment of grace, everything changes. All the transactional items fall aside. So just this kind of reminder that that's what we're invited to do. We're invited to preach a creative, electing word that people hear and they know they are chosen, elected in the moment, and that word is clothed in our in the weak words of our preaching. The content of the word takes a variety of form based on the context. My colleague, Wolf Jacobson, used to always be real good at saying to students, if someone comes and they're burdened by their conscience, the words, "you are forgiven," makes so much sense. If someone comes grieving the loss of a loved one, "you are forgiven," just rings hollow and dull. And so, to be clear, gospel grace takes a lot of different forms that we're invited to be attentive to, but chief among them is forgiveness. And I was struck by that when my daughter was still younger. And I mentioned we didn't watch a whole lot of TV in our house, but as we did, I would sometimes kind of sit in with her and watch, curious what she was watching and stuff. And in one particular year, two of the shows that I watched a lot of, and two of the shows she watched a lot of, all had at their core. So Walking Dead and Americans were my shows, and The 100 and Teen Wolf. And I was amazed at how much I had invested in the character of Teen Wolf over the year. The dominant theme, the turning point in every series was forgiveness. This absolute necessity that communities cannot persist absent forgiveness. And then Hamilton came out kind of similar. And I just watching this, I was like, oh my word, this is our story. Like, why are we not giving this more attention? All right, I gotta move more quickly because I don't want to get it plotted out. All right, next, kind of sin boldly. Because grace is freedom to act even when success is uncertain or failure seems likely, because forgiveness is sure of God's promise to redeem the world. The Christian phrase, "Your kingdom come," from the Catechism, not because human faith and prayer make the kingdom come. God's kingdom comes of its own, but we pray that it might be realized in us. And I think most of us know the story, the background to the sin boldly. Luther is in the Wartburg. He's kind of hiding out because there's a price on his head. He's masquerading as Euchre Jorg for some time, and meanwhile, it feels like the Reformation is going to hell in a handbasket. And he's exchanging letters with Melanchthon. Melanchthon is really anxious. He feels like there are factions. There's about absent Luther's strong personality presence. Some feel like the Reformation is moving way, way too fast. Everything's got to slow down. And others feel like the Reformation is moving way too slow and it's got to speed up. Sound like any congregations? And Melanchthon's kind of caught in the middle. Melanchthon he's very bright, very capable. He doesn't have the confidence of Luther or the presence of Luther, and he's worried that anything he does could just end the whole Reformation. It will all be his fault. It's easy to be hard on Melanchthon, tenderfoot, all of the names he's acquired over the years. But it's important to remember, when Melanchthon's writing Luther about this, when he's kind of in charge in Luther's stead of the Reformation, he's 27 years old. 27. This is his very first Reformation. So, cut him some slack. And when Luther writes back, I don't know if we have Melanchthon's letter. When Luther writes back, he writes and essentially it says, Philip, your problem is that you're worried about fictitious sins. Of what might be sinful. God only forgives real sins. And then goes on to say, so, sin boldly, but believe and rejoice more boldly still. And then ends by saying, and you too pray, for you also are maybe sinners. And I think where the sin boldly becomes really, really important right now is we have some major challenges we've already described about climate, about social justice, about isolation, depression, all kinds of things. And there is rarely a clear answer. And if we wait until we have the answer, we simply will not act. There is no perfect in this world, but there is forgiveness. And so that's where it comes, one of my first colleagues in parish ministry used to love to say, the only absolute in this world is the promise of absolution. I might skip this next video just to keep moving. So sometimes I think of Luther as kind of the original Nike, sin boldly, but believe and rejoice more boldly still, or just do it, and then run a church for absolution. And the difference that makes in daily lives, whether it's parenting, and choices between work and home, or decisions about how to allocate your time in ministry, or decisions about voting across the board, there's rarely a perfect answer. And so you are invited to act in faith, not knowing it will be right or wrong or somewhere in between, and then return for the promise of absolution so that you can go out and do it again and be anchored in that primary identity. And acknowledging, this would be a great place to go to some Eustace Luther himself sometimes forgets that. It is probably the best evidence of Luther's sense of Simul Justus is Luther's life. All right, last one, really quickly, is what I've been thinking about more, and if I haven't thought, it needs more development, is to think about the conversation and consolation of the faithful, and how important it is to be that we were made to be in relationship with others, and the conviction again that it's in communities of care that relationships are formed, and conversations can be had, and fears can be faced. Assumptions can be challenged, people can be pushed to grow and change, and all of that. And I think when I think about that, the conversation and consolation and that sort of mutual discussion and encouragement and comfort and the giving of courage, I think sometimes too, I wondered if we could add another C word in correction. And can we get better in the church about conversing, about consoling, but in love being able to say, I think we can do this better. And I think, again, to Chad's question last time I was talking, that's where I see the incredible value of making room for people who see things differently or at a different place or have had a different experience, being able to receive that critique or word of correction as part of what it means to be the church, part of what it means to be a community. Right, literally, I'm going to skip. So, this is kind of what I find, some of the things I find valuable in Luther's theology, timely counsel to help us all for a word that creates hearers and communities burning with hope. All right, 8:45.